All right, today we're going to learn about how to combine these things together with foiling and other things like that. So number one, what we're going to be doing is distributing. And so I need to multiply that square root of 3 by both things in the parentheses. So you have to keep in mind that you can only multiply outsides with outsides and insides with insides. And you also have to remember that you can only add things when they have the same insides. So those are the two things to remember. So when I multiply square root of 3 times 2, so square root of 3 times square root of 2 is square root of 6. I can multiply them because they're both inside the radical. Now when I multiply square root of 3 times 5, well, 5's not underneath the radical, and so it has to stay outside of the radical, and the 3 will stay inside. Now I can't add those together because they have different insides, and I can't break either of them down, so that's my final answer. Number 2 is I have to now FOIL, and so if you're a FOIL person, you would do the first, which 3 times 3 is 9, and then you would do the outside. 3 times negative square root of 6 is negative 3 square root of 6, and then you would do the inside. Square root of 6 times 3 is 3 square root of 6, and then you do the last. Square root of 6, and this is the last one's always the hardest. Square root of 6 times square root of 6. We have a double here because there's 2 6's underneath that radical, and so what you have to remember is that when you have 2 6's under a radical, or 2 of anything under a radical, if it's a square root, then it gets to come out of the radical. So I don't need to have that underneath there anymore. So then I would add like terms. So this 9 is like terms with this negative 6 or the minus 6, and so what that gives me is 3. And then the middle two terms, negative 3 square root of 6 plus positive 3 square root of 6, that would equal 0, so those completely cancel, and my final answer is 3. Now I'm going to show you number 3 using the box method. You could have done this with 2, and this is my preferred method. So I'm going to make myself a box. I put square root of 2 plus 7 and square root of 2 minus 5. I multiply together the corresponding rows and columns. So in that first one here, that is a double. So since it's a double, it can come out of the radical. For the next one, I would get 7 radical 2. Next one, I get negative 5 radical 2. And the last one, I get negative 35. So now I can generally add both diagonals, but not always. So in this case, I can add this diagonal, and that gets me 2 radical 2. I can also add this diagonal, and that gets me negative 33. So you can switch around the order if you want. I don't care which order you put those things, but that's your final answer. Right, the next one, I'm going to make another box. I have 3 and 2 radical 3, and I have 5 plus 5 radical 3. First box is pretty easy, 15. The second box, I can multiply the outsides together and get 10, because 5 times 2 is 10, and the 3 stays underneath. The next one, I can again multiply the outsides, get 15, and the 3 stays underneath. Last one's the hard one. I'm going to multiply together the outsides, so 10. And then I have to remember I have my double. That's my double, so that can come on the outside. And so my final box will be 30. So I'm going to add my diagonals now. So 15 and 30 get me 45. And I'm going to add this diagonal as well. That gets me 25 radical 3. And that's my final answer. Another one. I make my box. I put 4 plus radical 3 and 2 minus radical 2. My first box is 8. My second box is 2 radical 3. My third box is negative 4 radical 2. And my last box is negative radical 6. This time they were different underneath the radical, so I couldn't make a double. So now whenever I try to add the diagonals, I can't because none of them have the same insides. So my final answer would just be 8 plus the next box, and the last box. And that's my final answer. All right, the last one. This one's a little weird because it's our first fraction of the lesson. And so what we need to do is we need to rationalize the bottom because we don't like that square root of 3 right there. And so previously I taught you that you just multiply by itself. Now let me tell you why that can't work. The reason that can't work is because you're obligated to distribute that. And if you would distribute that, you get 2 radical 3 plus 3. And that solved nothing because I still have a radical underneath there. So what we have to do is multiply by the conjugate. And so what the conjugate is it's the same thing, the same numbers, 2 and square root of 3. You just change the sign in between them. So it's now a minus instead of a plus. It's kind of like when we used to do factoring and I did difference of squares. You get like x plus 3x minus 3, a squared minus b squared. Those are conjugates of each other. Right? I do the same thing to the top that I did to the bottom. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to distribute that square root of 5 to both things. So square root of 5 times 2 is 2 square root of 5. And square root of 5 times square root of 3 is square root of 15. So that's my numerator of the fraction. Now the bottom of the fraction, you have to go off to the side and you have to do the little box method. And I'm going to show you what happens. We've already multiplied some conjugates together on the previous page. So I'm going to get, for my first box, I'm going to get 2 radical 3 in my second one, negative 2 radical 3 in my third one, and then I have a double in my last one. So it's just 3 and it's a negative because one's a positive, one's a negative. So what happens with conjugates that's really nice is that those middle two terms will always cancel. That's the nice thing about a conjugate. That's why you multiply with a 1. And so then I just add my other diagonal and I get 1. So if you want to remember whenever you're foiling or if you're doing the box method, if they are conjugates, the O and the I will always cancel. These two will always cancel. So you cannot do those two boxes, or when you FOIL, you could skip the OI and only do the F and the L. And so that is my final answer. You don't even have to put the 1 if you don't want to.